everybody, and welcome to the Comic Book Bears podcast. I'm Bill Zanowitz.
I'm Brian Pittard.
And I'm Steve Morey.
And we are your hairy, heavy homos that talk about comic books, but you don't have to be a hairy, heavy homo to listen in, or in this case, stream in. And we are thrilled on this episode to welcome writer Zack Kruse to our comic book review show here. Zack is a scholar of comics, film, and American literature. He's currently an assistant professor at Michigan State University. His essays have been published in Inks, the Journal of the Comic Studies Society, Studies in Comics and Critique Studies in Contemporary Fiction. His comic strip Mystery Solved appeared in Skeptical Inquirer, and that's actually how I was first exposed to Zack. And he is a regular contributor to a number of comic book podcasts. He is here to talk about his new book, Mysterious Travelers, Steve Ditko and a Different Kind of Liberalism, which has just been published by University Press of Mississippi. Now, if you are familiar with a lot of Ditko's work, a lot of his philosophy-driven comics show a debt and alignment, for lack of a better word, to objectivism. But Zack is presenting a counter-argument to that Ditko's philosophy draws on a complicated network of ideas that is best understood as mystic liberalism. Did I get everything right there, Zack?
Yeah, that covers it. You did it. Hooray!
All right, good to hear. So before we get into the Ditko talk, we have a custom on our show. The first question for guests is always the same question. How did you first get into comic books?
I think, like a lot of people, they were just kind of handed to me at a certain point. I remember the first comic I remember having. Oh goodness, I know I wrote this number in the book, but now I can't remember it. But it's an issue of Batman. It's right before year one. That was written by Mystery
Max Collins?
Yeah, Max Collins. Yeah, Max Allen Collins. Issue of Batman where there's two guys dressed as Batman and they're strangling one another on the cover, like orange cover. They're choking each other. So it's like early 400s.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first comic I remember owning. I remember just staring at that cover just forever and just being just mesmerized by the fact that there were not one but two Batmen and that they might choke each other to death. Like what mysteries await me on the inside of this this magical tome. But before that, I had, like the requisite book and record sets and, that sort of thing. Like I had I had like the He-Man books and like I had like this, there's like a Spider-Man book I had with, where he's like at the circus and some sort of hijinks happen at the circus. That sort of thing. But that Batman issue, that's the first comic I remember owning. And it was all over from there.
So most people, when they think of Ditko, immediately Spider-Man and Doctor Strange come to mind, but there's a lot more there. Mm-hmm. So for people who may not know who Ditko is, do you want to give an encapsulation of who the man was and
Sure.
What happened in his career there?
Sure. Yeah. Steve Ditko trained at what the school that we would now call the cartoonist school with in New York City there. And he started working in comics in 1953. A lot of his work came out from Charlton. He worked at Charlton. He produced work for Charlton from 1953 all the way up until the company folded in 1986. Most of his work was in sort of like the weird suspense and horror genres, but he did a number of superhero comics. At Charlton, he co-created Captain Atom with Joe Gill, but he would later say that was mostly Joe Gill's character. And then eventually he would move over to Marvel, working with Stan Lee, where he produced, again, weird suspense horror titles. Then eventually getting more superhero work, and he was inking a lot of different people too. Obviously, like you said, we all know about Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, but it was Ditko who did the red and yellow redesign for Iron Man's armor. It was Ditko who created the corner boxes that we all know and love. It was Ditko that came up with the plot device for the Incredible Hulk, that it's his emotions that change him into the Hulk, right? Before that, it was kind of a mess. After he leaves Marvel in 1966, he immediately went back to Charlton, where he did superhero work, where he created the new Blue Beetle, created the Question, did more work on Captain Atom, did lots more horror and suspense stuff. And then eventually he went to DC, where he did a number of titles there, Creeper, Hawk and Dove, and on and on. Just lots of things that I think people know but don't really realize were Ditko characters. He worked on a lot of those things. He eventually went back to Marvel and Charlton. But in the 1960s, though, when he's back doing superhero comics at Charlton, that's also the time when he creates probably his most well-known independent character, Mr. A, the character that is explicitly based on Ayn Rand's objectivism. But, it's important to sort of say that the character is driven by those things and separate the character from the producer of that character. And then after that, he works really up until his death in 2018, producing new comics. He never stopped working. Mostly, almost entirely independent stuff, but he had a few things at Marvel here and there, Speedball, but a few things much later in his career as well. And a few pinups for DC at different points. So I mean, he had a 65-something year career, 66 year career in comics that never stopped. And I think that that's one of the things that is often most not sort of one of the things that doesn't really register with people a lot is that he was working the entire time. There's a persistent myth that he retired in 2000 or 1999, which is categorically false. I mean, so I mean, that's more or less who he was. The only other thing I'd add to that I think is worth noting is that when Ditko sits down and he draws a page, I mean, there's lots of different artists that I love for a lot of different reasons. But the way that he laid out a page to me is second to none. The way that he captured storytelling, the way that he captured emotions within like the rigidity of a 9-panel grid and like forcing us to sort of think through like the beats of a story and sort of the interiority of a character within those constraints is really, really impressive and really unlike a lot of his peers who were doing really interesting and experimental things with layouts, where Ditko was saying, very often was saying, here's the format. Let's see what we can do with the format. How can I make the format tell the story and move my readers? And through that, he gives us an opportunity to understand superheroes in new and really complicated ways. I think Spider-Man is the sort of the urtext for the way that we understand superheroes now. It is predicated on what Steve Ditko does, especially in the Master Planner story arc in Spider-Man. The hero that always gets back up, that he is a human being, that he is you, he is me, he is all of us. He can be anyone at any time, that he's defined not by his powers, not by his costume, but by his heart. That's a very particular Ditko notion that I think molds the way that we think about and respond to superheroes now. And I don't think it's overstating it to thank his particular work for that shift in the way that we respond to these things.
Okay, and in your book, again, you make the argument that his body of work can best be understood as mystic liberalism, and that there are different tenets of mystic liberalism, dark karma, and cosmic inner space. Why don't you give us some background about that theory?
Sure. Yeah.
Where you come from with that?
Yeah. So the first thing I think is really important to say is that at no point would Ditko have ever identified him within the boundaries that I'm laying out here, within this sort of theoretical framework. He wouldn't. And he couldn't have, because I invented the term. So, but even if he had known it, I mean, he wouldn't have done that, right? And for a variety of reasons. The most important of which I think is that he, I think, very clearly considered himself an independent thinker and navigator of the world. And I think he very strongly believed that each individual should have their own philosophy and then should live by that philosophy. So when I put him within this framework that I'll describe in a moment, I don't mean to say that he is specifically this thing. I just mean to say that his ideas operate within this network, right? That they are better contextualized within this larger network rather than the very narrow objectivist lens that people try to sort of view him through and work very hard to view him through. So that's sort of what I mean by that. But as for what mystic liberalism is, I think that I think that it's really important to understand that in the post-World War I period and in the post-World War II period, that there are really radical shifts of consciousness in the way that we are thinking about and responding to the world, that are very, very directly related to the traumas of those events and those in the interim period there. And I'm not the only person to say this. This is not an original thought, but people were traumatized by World War I, by World War II, and responded to them by sort of rethinking the ways that they approached capitalism, ways that they approached liberalism. And I don't mean liberalism as in what we call, like, what someone like might call today's American left. I mean liberal as in the philosophical notion, right? Like David Hume, John Locke, that people in those categories. So they're really sort of starting to shift and change in how they think about these things. And one of the things that happens, particularly in the interim period, the interwar period, is that there is a return to sort of spiritualist ideas. There's a shift in the way that we are thinking about Christianity, that they're just thinking about spiritualism and religion broadly. In the middle of that shift, a lot of people are turning back to what we would now call, and what they did call at the time, New Thought, which is sort of the mind power movement that's rooted in the teaching of Phineas Quimby, and would later become something like Christian Science, and was sort of part and parcel of what Madame Blavatsky believed. And people are sort of taking those sort of mind power ideas, and they're applying them in a variety of different contexts. So one of the people that's really interested in that is Wallace Wattles. He's a Christian socialist from Indiana. And he writes a book about using the power of the mind, power of prayer to get rich, and so on and so forth. So, and what Wattles is thinking about is really sort of social democracy. He's thinking about equitability and sort of a fair distribution of wealth and goods and resources and all of those things. But people who
is he a precursor to Norman Vincent Peale?
Yes, absolutely. So that's happening there, right? Then after World War II, when we're starting to rethink capitalism, because capitalism had very clearly failed, and by way of the Great Depression, capitalism very clearly failed. The FDR's New Deal policies are very popular, right? Or they're generally popular with people. So in order to sort of reconstitute itself, liberal capitalism is finding new ways to sort of reapproach the world, right? And eventually establishes what we now call neoliberalism. But what is also happening at the same moment is this sort of notion of what Kevin Kruse, the historian, the very famous historian, calls Christian libertarianism. And in that same moment, there's this sort of Christian libertarian moment, right, where they're trying to sort of fuse Christianity and libertarian and liberal ideals. Within that movement is Norman Vincent Peale. Also within that movement is someone like Dale Carnegie, right? How to Win Friends and Influence People. I mean, How to Win Friends and Influence People in Peale's books, these are huge sellers. So many people are reading these things. But what they're doing is they are adopting the old New Thought ideals, right? The old Christian socialist New Thought ideals, and then applying them to sort of this new breed of white collar neoliberal capitalism, right? Like, how can you make the power of your mind? How can you use the power of your mind to make you fit in and prosper within this new corporate landscape? And this is, it becomes this elaborate thing that people are really invested in and still are invested in. And it morphs and it changes over time. And there are a number of people who contribute to this, but I think probably the person that people most identify with this is someone like Rhonda Byrne in her book, The Secret, right? It's a very popular book where if you just wish for something, you can make it happen. And if bad things happen to you, it's because you had bad thoughts, right? It's the same thing here, right? When she says that, that's a very liberal individualist idea, right? That you are to blame for your problems, that there are no exterior circumstances. It is just you. You're the problem here. So that's a very, that's baked into the very notion of liberalism. So all of those things are sort of happening here. Strangely, in certain ways, Ayn Rand and her one-time lover, and then excommunicate Nathaniel Branden, get really wrapped up in this. Nathaniel Branden he doesn't quite say mind power, but he uses something called, he refers to this as self-esteem, and self-esteem to him is responsible for everything. Every good thing and bad thing that happens to you comes from self-esteem. This is straight up and down New Thought with just a different gloss on it. So Branden is really important in sort of the early sculpting of objectivist ideals and forming the Nathaniel Branden Institute and sort of disseminating Rand's ideas. So his sort of mystical notions about self-esteem, which are predicated on mind power, New Thought stuff, are cooked into objectivism in this moment, right, where people are starting to rethink all of these things, and they're very literally applying these ideas to neoliberal politicians, namely Ronald Reagan. Reagan loves this stuff. He eats it up. He cannot get enough of it. Nixon seems to like it, right? To different degrees, right? Kevin Kruse's books discuss that really well. But Reagan is really sort of the person that soaks this up the most. And he even goes so far as to quote Manly P. Hall and The Secret Destiny of America and all of these things regularly in speeches. So Ditko, where Ditko comes into all of this to sort of bring it back around to this, to tie it all together, Ditko's idea sort of nestle pretty nicely into what's happening here, right? As you read his comics, or as I read his comics, so many of them are about exploring the interior spaces of your mind and better understanding who you are and overcoming, right? Finding all of the bad things inside of you and doing all the evil sort of ghosts and goblins that haunt you, and doing a little bit of internal ghost busting and exterminating these things so that you can live a better life, right? Like materializing a better self. That's wrapped up in all of this. And the fact that he's interested in Rand also puts him in this conversation. But just as importantly as all of that is when Ditko leaves Marvel and he's really starting to dig in with independent publishing. He's not just publishing with Wit's End. He's not just publishing with Warren magazines or with Charlton or going to DC. He's also publishing in Reason magazine, right? The libertarian magazine. And Mr. A appears in Reason. The Avenging World appears in Reason. He's a part of this discourse. He's a part of this dialogue that sort of is emboldening this very distinct version of liberal politics, right? That is explicitly in its own mind, whether we all agree with this or not, is a separate conversation, but in its own mind is very separate from the political right in America and the political left in America. It imagines itself as something entirely separate and individualistic and individual that steps away from what it sees as statism on either sides, right? It's liberalism. So that's where Ditko fits in with all of this. He's not easily understood as an acolyte of Rand. He's not easily understood as a Reagan Republican. He's not easily understood as a Truman Democrat or any of these things, right? He is distinctly his own thinker, his own person, his own manifester of ideals and ideology, right? So, and where he sits in this conversation is right there in that sort of mystic liberal web of all of these ideas that are sort of permeating outwards from those things. So I hope that I haven't sort of rambled too much there, because I know I'm throwing so much out at this, but there's a lot happening here. There's so much happening here that I think is really really important. I guess the last thing I want to say to that, to sort of speak to the relevance, is not just someone like Reagan quoting Manly P. Hall, but the Trumps either literally were, or at least imagined themselves to be, or positioned themselves to be great friends with Norman Vincent Peale in his later years. And Trump's book, The Art of the Deal, that's a straight up and down New Thought, power of positive thinking, Dale Carnegie self-help book, right? I mean, it relies on these same general principles. I think it's much more insidious, but it relies on these very things. So So that's where I think Ditko fits into this conversation. It's not an apologetic. It's not saying that we shouldn't criticize or we shouldn't be thinking complexly about his work. We should, but it's important to understand that what he's doing is not so easily dismissed or embraced by this very one particular set of ideals.
One thing I have to say, Zach, about reading your book is it was full of surprises. Now, I have to say, going into it, just from what I've read in the past and how I've interpreted material, that I always interpreted Ditko as an objectivist absolutist. And I think I have to back this up with a little bit of my own exposure to Rand's work and objectivism. Right after I graduated college, my father was in a theater production of Night of January 16th, which is one of the plays that Ayn Rand wrote. Yeah. And it was god awful, and my dad especially was god awful in it. It was so bad, but there was something there where I just had to know a little bit more. And in reading works, there was nothing I could grab onto except for one thing, which I did agree with, in that there is a separation in human volition between experience and consciousness. Mm-hmm. And this is where I want to come into where your book surprised me. I would think that the best illustration of that would be Doctor Strange, but you present that as being applied to the more conventional heroes like Blue Beetle and Spider-Man. You know, like, I did not see that coming. So thank you for all those surprises in there.
I do what I can. Right? The shock value. If you come to the book for any reason, it should be the shock value alone. But you raise a good point, though, because I think that's an important thing to understand, is that his philosophy is baked into everything, mm-hmm. right? From 53 up to 2018, it's in all of it, and it develops over time. But yeah, it's in everything. It permeates all of it, not just the stuff where the prose is particularly, let's say, didactic, right? Mm-hmm. Not just Mr. A, not just the question. It's not just static. It's everywhere, and it's visual, right? Because he has to learn to do it visually, because he knows that once he turns over a comic with the panel script, that there's a very good chance that one of the handlers that he's working with is going to alter his notions in some way. So he has to work very hard to make sure that his ideas, his philosophy, is coming through in a way that cannot be sort of tampered with. Mm-hmm. And that comes through, in the layouts and in the ways that characters emote and all that sort of thing.
Okay, well, I am not going to bogart this interview, though I have plenty more questions for you later. So I'm going to hand off my interview baton to Steve. Steve, what have you got for Zach?
Well, I think it is really interesting looking at how you kind of show his own philosophical growth by looking at the characters and how they grow, the characters that he's writing and how they grow. And I've never made the connection before between Spider-Man, Peter Parker, and Blue Beetle Ted Kord until you started looking at that. And it was really funny when you have panels, you're looking back and forth between two different panels where here's Peter Parker as Ditko draws him, and here's Ted Kord as Ditko draws him. And there is a similarity there. But kind of going along that idea, where you started a Peter Parker who's just starting to understand his place in the world, but also his own internal landscape and his understanding of self, mm-hmm. and how he develops. And here's Ted Kord, who's an older version of that. He's still learning, still growing, but has a much more certain morality and understanding of self and his self compared to others. And then you have his mentor, the Question, and you've also got, down the line, you've also got a Mr. A, who's sort of like the perfect example of, objectivism in practice. When you talk a little bit later on about Alan Moore's sort of adaptation of the Charlton characters for Watchmen, it's not necessarily a criticism of Ditko's characters, but almost like a reimagining of his characters. I kind of read that, going back and forth through it, as possibly Rorschach might be the inevitable evolution or final evolution of that whole, that whole track, that whole line of existence. Because it's happening several years after Mr. A would have originally been published. If Mr. A kept going, would it have turned into a Rorschach? And I kind of have half a question, half more of an observation on this. Do you think that if Ditko had continued writing a character like Mr. A, had really focused more on that kind of character development and that kind of that kind of direction, do you think he could have himself gone down that pathway of somebody so disillusioned, stuck in that philosophy, but so disillusioned with the fact that the rest of the world has not caught up to that? Do you think he would have continued down that line, or do you think it was just inevitable? He has to leave that behind, go to something else like a Static or a Mocker, or
Right.
so on and so forth.
Well, I have an answer for this. So
Yay.
I think that to sort of rewind that a little bit, I think that it's a very fair question to ask whether or not Mr. A becomes sort of like a Zarathustra character, right? Like Nietzsche's Zarathustra, right? He comes down from the mountain, he tries to impart his wisdom upon the people, and the people who are just they're not here, they're not going to listen to it. And he's just like, well, I don't know. In some ways, I think that's fairly true. And Ditko did continue to publish Mr. A and do new Mr. A's all the way up to his death.
Really?
Yeah. So they were things that he published with Robin Snyder, and were mostly available through Kickstarters. But he was doing new, and if not new, then revised versions of older Mr. A stories. So one thing that I think it's important to understand about Mr. A is that he is at one level he is the sort of apex character, right? Like that's it. He's plateaued. This is the peak. This is what you can be. This is the ideal, right? And I think using the word ideal there is really important, because I'm not so sure that Mr. A actually exists, right? Like, right. I mean, obviously he doesn't, you know what I mean? But I think he's an idea, right? Mm-hmm. And when Mr. A appears, he is an idea which the other characters in the story must respond to. They must respond to their own sort of internal state. They are forced to face their own sense of reason and rationality, their own conscience. And what do they do with that? What do they do in that moment? And I think the question's pretty similar, right? It's like when Mr. A shows up and just hands someone his card, right? he's a strange looking, sort of intimidating figure for a variety of reasons. But he's not especially physically imposing, right? He's frightening. And he hands you a card, and then they quake with terror, right? What are they quaking at terror with? The choice, the notion, right? That they might not live up to this ideal that they know can exist. So in that way, I think Mr. A is a peculiar character, right? And if you read the really late Mr. A stories, when there's a story with Rex Grain where he's friends with a guy who's being blackmailed by some shady business partners, and the guy kills himself because he's being blackmailed and because he's afraid that what these people are going to say about him is going to ruin him and destroy his family. So this guy thinks that killing himself is the way out. That's obviously a pretty extreme choice for someone to make. And if you take sort of the view of Mr. A that person is bad because they made an irrational choice, because they succumbed to their oppressors, right? Because they succumbed to those that would victimize him, then that's one way to read this. But I don't think that that's what the text actually says. I don't think that's what the comic says, because Mr. A seems to think that this is still a good man who made a bad choice, but for reasons that are really understandable. And he's trying to sort of rationalize that. And in a strange moment, he tries to comfort the widow. And whether or not that comfort is successful or not is, that's a different conversation. But he does try to sort of extend some sort of like human kindness and grace in that way. There's another Mr. A story where one of Rex Grain's friends, Rex Grain being sort of the alter ego of Mr. A for those who don't know, her name is Lana, and she's being tormented by this guy. She's a singer, and this guy says, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to pour acid down your throat or some such thing, right? Like, and when Mr. A shows up to try to stop this man, Lana, doesn't attack her oppressor. She attacks Mr. A because he's trying to help her. Says he's not really going to hurt me, right? In a weird way, the story becomes about relationship violence and being victimized and abuse and trauma. And it's not saying that Lana is making good choices, but it is trying. And again, whether the reader feels it succeeds or not is a different story. But it is attempting to sort of understand trauma and the ways in which trauma informs decisions, right? So where I'm going with this, and sort of and hopefully in response to your question, is that over time, Mr. A doesn't really change much, right? He doesn't really evolve. He doesn't become that thing that Rorschach becomes, right? That character doesn't do that. Instead, he sort of exists as this non-entity, this sort of allegorical figure that sort of steps in and allows characters to work through and the reader to experience what the sort of the supporting cast is experiencing, right? And then draw their own conclusions, or hopefully draw a very certain kind of conclusion. The other thing that I would add about that is that when you read, if you were to read Rorschach as sort of a de-evolution, right, of the trajectory of Peter Parker and Blue Beetle, and the potential of them becoming the Questioner, Mr. A. I think that that's a pretty reasonable reading of Rorschach, and a pretty reasonable reading of how I think Alan Moore views Steve Ditko's politics and their outcomes, right? The outcomes of his philosophy. I think that's a very fair, very reasonable way to sort of interpret that. Whether or not I agree with that interpretation is a different matter. I think for the most part, I mean, how do I want to say this? I think that my politics align with Alan Moore's, right? Much more closely than they align with Steve Ditko's. So I appreciate that critique, and I like it. And I think that this is one of the things I sort of allude to a little bit in the book, is that I think that in making that critique, there are some oversimplifications that get made about the source texts in terms of what they're actually trying to do. Because I'm not so sure that I think that Ditko's often looking for a very human answer. I think he's looking for compassion. I think he's looking for fun ways to sort of match compassion and kindness with his own sort of very distinct libertarian, liberal philosophic worldview that's informed by Ayn Rand. So would Rorschach sort of, or does he do those things? I mean, he does, but I'm not so sure that that's the cleanest reading or cleanest interpretation of Ditko's comics.
And I'll keep it quick this time too. I think I actually really like that point, because right around the time, obviously, of Watchmen, you have a lot of these darker, grittier reinterpretations of classic characters along the lines of somebody who takes the vigilantism to the final point, which is, the criminal must die. Like, that must be it. The criminal must end. And I know, there are points, obviously, when Ditko's writing The Questioner, writing Mr. A, where that happens. That's the outcome of, that criminal story, is that either, that the hero either lets the criminal die or directly causes the death of the criminal. That right to kill that you talk about a lot in the book. Do you think that if Ditko had that type of influence, if the comic creators in the 80s and the late 70s were reading Ditko and reading that kind of character action, do you think they just grossly misinterpreted Ditko's ideas of like, well, yeah, vigilante can have these, can create this type of outcome with his interactions with the criminal element, and in doing so, just kind of almost in a way colored those original Ditko creations and those original Ditko stories in that new light. That, well, okay, obviously, where you got to have gritty, we've got to have dark, we've got to have like violent, deadly vigilantism, because, well, Ditko did the same thing.
Right.
Is that something where really that's really what could have happened here is the misinterpretation of his characters.
They're bad readings.
Mm-hmm.
Right, they're bad readings of his comics. So and Ditko was criticized about this at the time, right? I mean, so this isn't like an anachronistic thing, like us like imagining or implanting this criticism on him now. I mean, that was the criticism of Mr. A, or one of the criticisms of Mr. A. That was a criticism that he received for the question, and some of those criticisms happened in the pages of Wit's End, right? There's a famous Mr. E comic about that, but yeah, they're bad readings. Which I guess I'm being a little harsh about that, but I feel like maybe the harshness is warranted, just to be clear. He doesn't actually, like, in order for that argument to stick, you would have to believe that Steve Ditko really thinks that vigilantes should be wandering the streets shoving muggers off of high rises. I mean, let's
willy-nilly.
Like, I mean, is this really what we think? Is this really what we think Steve Ditko believes? Right? I don't.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's not true, and it certainly doesn't. And even if let's just say hypothetically it were true, that's not what his comics show, because characters like Mr. A are not ending the lives of criminals because they can. They are participating, like in Greek tragedies. I mean, as Ditko sort of conceives it, they are allegorical figures in Greek tragedies. These are allegorical actions that demonstrate some sort of philosophic truth or some sort of philosophic ideal. So when Angel, the aptly named Angel, dies in that first Mr. A story, there's something going on there, intellectually, philosophically, that he wants us to think about and sort of process, right? When Mr. A kicks those two guys into that sewer and they rush to their death and they drown, they go into like some darkened internal space. There's something philosophic happening there. There's a series of choices that lead to that moment that are unlike many of the other deaths that happen in earlier comics, like very, very unlike. He's asking us to think about this. And he says as much in the essay Violence, the Phony Issue, right? That this is fantasy violence. Fantasy violence serves a narrative and intellectual purpose. Make of that what you will. So, and the other thing I would add to that is that characters like the Blue Beetle, when the Blue Beetle thinks that he's committed murder, has maybe not an existential crisis, but he has at least a mild crisis of conscience and asks himself whether or not he should even be a superhero anymore. Right? Should I stop? And Ditko's writing that, right? That's a Ditko story where the superhero is actively questioning himself because he might be implicated in a death, right? So it's not as though he thinks that every superhero should be running around murdering people. And in fact, he hated anti-heroes. He wrote any number of screeds against anti-heroes. He did not like them. He did not like that moral grayness. He thought that they were philosophically incomplete, right? Mm-hmm. So he's not a fan of that. But now the other side of that, the but to that is again just the same as his philosophy fits within this network of other ideas, right? That his superheroes kill people, right, at a superficial level. That his superheroes kill people fits within something that's really changing in the Zeitgeist, right? And you can very easily see the urge, the impulse to read his comics, and that very stripped down, simplified way, because people are reading Brian Garfield, right? They're reading Death Wish. They're reading The Executioner. They're watching They're getting ready to see Dirty Harry for the first time, right? They're angry about Kitty Genovese. Any number of things are going on in the culture where that invite that bad reading, that make that bad reading really palatable. So you can sort of see, how these things happen. It makes sense. And if you apply something like the right to kill, right, the right of fictional characters to kill other fictional characters in these fantasy settings, and then you think about a novel like Death Wish or even the Bronson movies, and you go, man, that's not good. This is really problematic, right? Like, this is white supremacy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is absolute white supremacy, and we should be criticizing this in all sorts of ways. But I don't think Ditko's really participating in that conversation. But you can absolutely see that his work is happening in the same moment where it would be implicated in that matrix of other bad ideas. So there's something going on there. We have to think about that when his characters kill. What is it that we're actually seeing? Are we seeing a literal murder, or are we being asked to sort of process some sort of other intellectual, philosophical ideal or experiment or something along those lines?
And actually, my last question, right off of that, do you think in his more fantasy and very obviously sort of like the horror comics, the morality plays in the horror comics and the sci-fi work that he was doing in the 50s and early 60s, as well as Doctor Strange, where it's all very metaphorical. The same questions, the same thought experiments are being presented to the reader, where it's very, very philosophical, very, very out there. Or Shade the Changing Man, it's very, very meta. Do you think the same kind of messages, the same kind of information that he's trying to impart to the reader are more successful when he does that way? Because there's absolutely no way that it can be assigned to something more realistic as a human-looking, realistic vigilante character killing very realistic, very human-looking criminal characters. Can't be misinterpreted, can't sort of follow that the Punisher comes out of that or whatever. Do you think he's more successful when he goes very, metaphysical?
Well, that's a really good question. I wasn't expecting this question, Steve. Wow.
Sorry.
You got me.
Sorry. It's a long one.
No, it's okay. This is a good question. I don't think he's necessarily more successful. Well, let me put it to you this way. If you define success as readers understanding, I'm not sure that he's more successful. And the reason why I question whether or not he's more successful is because we have these pre-prescribed readings of Ditko. So if you read something like the published criticism of Ditko's work, right out of the way, like, someone's going to tell you, like, I love Steve Ditko, but first let me tell you how much I hate objectivism. Okay, fine, I got it. No one's asking you to like it. Like, I don't like it either. But like that's like right out of the gate, right? And then when they encounter something that's really complicated, like Shade the Changing Man, like the horror stories, like Doctor Strange, instead of really processing it and thinking through, like, oh my God, there is a unity here in these ideas, right? There's something really interesting happening here. The impulse in the past has been to dismiss it and say, well, it's not objectivist, so I don't know how it fits. How did he get here? How did he do this? What wizardry is this, right? So
literally.
Yeah, literally. So I'm not sure that it's more successful because people have been told what to think, and then they apply that. They try to apply a template, a badly formed template, to their understanding, and I'm not sure that they come up, ahead on that. So it's hard for me to say that he's more successful. But what I would say is this: I think that those stories, like Doctor Strange and Shade the Changing Man, those two especially, I think they are so heady and they are so far ahead of their time, and so thoughtful and engaged, especially when Ditko is in full control of Doctor Strange, or in the fullest possible control of Doctor Strange. That is just magic. And I'm not trying to be cute about that. Like that's just, there's something really powerful about those images, because they don't come from they don't come from doing mushrooms. They don't come from an acid trip. They don't come from being absorbed in, all sorts of, surrealist type things. I mean, he's aware of all of those things. He's not participating in the drugs, obviously, but he's aware of those things. But they are coming from a space that is really, I don't want to say pure, but because I think that's a word that carries some weird baggage, but they come from a place of, I think, as unbridled imagination as he was capable of in that moment. And in that sort of sense of unbridled imagination, he creates these fabulous landscapes, all of these places that are stand-ins for all of these different things, right? That makes so much sense, and every piece fits together so beautifully in Doctor Strange, right? Stephen Strange is the avatar for the self, the mindless ones as the horde that must be beaten back at all times, that exists within all of our minds, right? That the urge to join the mob, and the fascist impulse to keep the mob at bay, and then having to negotiate with that authoritarian impulse that so many of us struggle with, to keep the mob at bay but maintain your sense of reason. All of those things, as they come together in that story, it's just such a beautiful sort of distillation of those things. So in that way, I think it's more successful, right? Because it is such an artistic achievement. I mean, it is a true thing of beauty. So in that way, do I think that's more successful? Yes. Do I think it was better at reaching readers? I don't know.
I've got to give up my baton because I've got more questions. So we're going to go to Bryan, who is over here on my screen. And
wow.
Sorry I took up so much time, Bryan.
No, it's okay. There's so much here to unpack that I feel like, Zach, you're doing a fantastic job, and your book is so erudite, and I mean, this is so great. You're scratching the lit crit part of me that I gave up in college and had not ever re-engaged with.
Come back into the darkness.
Oh my gosh.
Bryan.
Well, we didn't have comics in that space when I was in undergraduate in the late 90s. And I wish we had, because there's so much interesting stuff. So I'm not going to go too deep with this. This is going to be sort of not superficial, but it's certainly a little more forward thinking. With the author and Ditko obviously as authorial voice, being a cartoonist and a writer, how do you decouple, or how much do you decouple their internal politics, philosophy, approach in storytelling, and in specifically in like forward, like looking at writers and artists and cartoonists today? Because I have someone like in my mind like Tom King, who obviously has a lot of politics that he brings to his work, right? And isn't a cartoonist, but is very, good at, communicating with cartoonists and telling his story. And like, how do you navigate the authorial intent of working in their philosophies with sort of the caricature sort of focused, like, well, no, this is how the Flash would do this, or this is how the Punisher would do this. Like, it's got to be really hard, especially when you don't necessarily have, like, Hickman's another great example. Hickman's probably a better example, right? Jonathan Hickman is famous for being very careful in how he explains his work and his intent. And I bet that as a lit crit, kind of like frustrates you because you don't have that primary source. You have to really just go with inference. So how do you approach that with like modern comics, and how useful is it, let's say, if they're like on Twitter all the time, like Tom King, or they're not on Twitter, they're on Twitter, but they don't talk about their work like a Hickman? Like, how do you navigate that in doing a sort of this criticism and this interpretation of comics?
Yeah, well, and Ditko's a different case, obviously, right? I mean, we have a documentary record of his claims, right, about creative process and what he's doing. I think like that sort of like death of the author thing, that, you know, that Barthian, you know, death of the author thing is important to sort of keep in mind. I think the first thing that we have to understand is that writers and artists, and for writers and artists that, you know, or that will see this or hear this, like, don't take this the wrong way, but they don't always know what they're doing, right? I mean, which is not to say they're not unprofessional, but like they're not always aware of the implications of what they say or their work, right? And we see that all the time. That, I mean, fire up your internet machine and you're going to see someone who said something that is grossly misinterpreted for a variety of reasons. So rather than relying on just what the artist and the writer say about a work, I think we have to rely on the context in which that work exists. That's the primary sort of, that's the base level here, right? I mean, Derrida says that, you know, everything is text. Well, everything is text. It exists within within these networks, right? So that's sort of the baseline set of information with me. What is the context in which this particular comics or issues of comics or graphic novel or whatever, where does it exist? And then after that, sort of peeling back that layer, the next layer is to start asking questions like, okay, so do we have a documentary record of what the artist said at the time, right? Are they doing interviews? Are there Twitter responses? Is there a blog post? You know, are there podcast interviews? Like, and absorb all of those things. But where it gets tricky, and I think is important, is to never dismiss those readings of their own texts, but to just take them as potential readings of the text, right? So if Tom, who I really like as a writer and just think he's a fine human being, if Tom says that this is what I'm doing with the Rorschach book right now, that's Tom's reading of his text, right? But that does not preclude me or any other critic from coming along and saying, okay, so this is Tom's reading of the text, but this is what the text seems to be doing in this particular moment. Here are the other things that are happening around this text that help us better understand X, Y, Z, D, E, F, right? So methodologically, it's a matter of it's a matter of identifying the most viable context possible, right? How do I interpret this? How well can I support my interpretation with the material circumstances of the text? Material circumstances meaning publication, which is editors, collaborative stuff, what the collaborators say, as well as the sort of social, political, and economic climate in which that thing is produced, right? So if Tom is producing, since we brought him up and he's sort of, you know, in the conversation here, if Tom is producing his Rorschach comic in 1987, let's just say, hypothetically, he's trying to do the exact same story in 1987 or 88. That's wildly, that I would interpret that very differently than that Rorschach comic in 2020, right? That Rorschach comic in Reagan's America, right, with all of its problems, versus that Rorschach comic in Trump's America with its exacerbated problems from the Reagan era, right? I mean, those are different things there, right? So we have to take those circumstances into account. And to me, I think that those are some of the most important circumstances. Like what, and to finish this answer, hopefully, is this is the same thing that I'm doing with Ditko, right? Is what is the historical material context in which these works exist, right? Not my prefabricated 2020 view of it, not just what Steve said about it, not what Stan said about it, not what Gil Kane or whoever said about it. What where does it fit historically? What is going on in this moment, right? That's the first layer. That's the baseline. And then build up from there by asking other questions and probing of other avenues.
So from my memory of Lit Crit, you're like a new historicist sort of perspective, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I actually remembered something from my undergraduate that wasn't like computer science, which was mostly what I studied. So follow on, Bill, I know you've got more questions, so I'll try to dial this in too much, or hopefully, I don't know. How do you, as someone sort of putting it in that new historicist kind of perspective, how do you answer to people who come at Ditko with their own modern or contemporary issues? And I'm asking this because I've been reading a lot of Andrew Sullivan lately, and he talks about the death of illiberalism and woke culture. And I don't want to turn this into an indictment of woke culture or anything like that, but like, how are you able to just stick to that and sort of have to like put a not a blinder, but at least a filter to like the kind of contemporary view of that? I'm just curious from an intellectual like perspective, like how do you navigate those waters?
Yeah, it can be. Those waters are often choppy. So I think the most important thing to me is to not dismiss those concerns, right? Because and not to have a level of expectation of people who level such concerns, to not have my expectation be that they have read every critical theory text that I've ever read, or that our ideals and our views and our interpretations of the world align perfectly. I think that's a problematic. That's a very childlike view of imagining things. We must agree. I think that's silly. So I think the first thing is to not immediately dismiss it. But if charges are leveled, if accusations are made, particularly as they relate to a subject which I'm studying, then if those charges have any merit at all, or any consequence is probably a better way to put that, then they have to be dealt with, and they have to be taken on a case-by-case basis, right? And there are instances where I have to say, like, yes, I understand this criticism. Yes, I agree that this is very troubling. But no, I don't agree that it fits within this particular paradigm, right? This very particular modern paradigm. That's important. So let me, and I'm not trying to dance around anything, but let me try to put a fine point on this. I think that it's incredibly important that we do not write apologetics for the past, right? Like, I don't buy this argument that, like, well, people were different then. People thought differently. I mean, okay, fine. But that doesn't mean that everyone was exactly aligned, that we were some monolith, that like, oh, well, Disney cartoons were pretty racist, in the 30s, and we should give that a pass because it was the 30s and everybody had a racist. Like, that is not true, right? There have always been voices of dissent, always. So I don't think it's a healthy or viable to write apologetics of the past. Rather, I think we have to sort of examine the past for what it is, and just say, yes, this is a great piece of art. Yes, this person said horrible things. What are the consequences of that thing? If you can't show me the consequences of that thing, then I'm not sure that we're really moving forward in some way. And for me, as a scholar, as someone who's trying, as a teacher, it's important to me to sort of find ways out, find ways forward. If we want change, if we want difference, then we have to acknowledge these things and say, like, yes, horrible things happened. Yes, they were horrible. No, don't feel bad about criticizing them. But don't just say it sucked and then move on and then say, like, well, sucked, destroy. Like, that's not productive. You have to find a way out. You have to find a way to correct. You have to find a way to heal. And I think if you're not willing to do that, if you only want to destroy things, then you're not participating in a conversation.
No, I think that's kind of where I fall too. There's trouble in both sides of the waters. They're both whatever. Is like, yeah, the instinct to destroy is not healthy. To just pretend it didn't happen or to shun it is not. You're not learning from it at all. You're not moving past it. Then you're not dealing with it. So
yeah, and that doesn't mean forgive it.
No,
right?
Absolutely right.
And there are so many things that we should not forgive at all, but that doesn't change our immediate circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. Bill, I think I'm all tapped out.
Great. All right. Well, I do have to apologize about the Andrew Sullivan squirm, but how can we miss you if you won't go away? So, Bryan, if you could you just throw up that graphic that I pulled before from the book? Because as far as I know, this is, I can't put hand to Bible on everything that's come out of Tomorrow's, but as far as I know, Zach, this is the first time in your book that this image from Superman 400 from 1984, I guess, has been reprinted.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, this really is one of the best testimonies to Ditko's genius of an iconic figure split between the people that he inspires hope and inspires fear in.
Mm-hmm.
And with a work like this, which was a pinup, I think there are very few creators from his time that were as effective in this kind of storytelling, of the single panel storytelling. I also think of some of the villain profiles from the Spider-Man annuals. Everything you needed to know about those. You didn't even need to know, in some context, what the write-up was on the side. What he gave you said it all. So I was just wondering if you're in agreement with that, but second, if you could comment on, particularly the pinup work, because there's a lot of it in his canon.
Yeah. Yes, I do agree with that. I think in certain ways, and I guess this is up for debate, but I think he's without peer as it comes to those pinups and trying to establish a very specific, distinct idea. Whether that idea is fully received or understood by readers, as I keep saying, it's not, folks' mileage will vary, but yeah, everything you need to know about how he imagines or wants Superman to be imagined in this moment is in that. You don't need dialogue, you don't need anything, and you don't even need the S itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is his notion of the hero. This is the ideal hero. And that the ideal hero walks this path between two worlds, right? Between the just and the unjust, between the oppressor and the oppressed, between rationality and irrationality, right? That they are beacons of light, that they should be looked to, and that's, when you say things like that we should look to strong, even allegorical men for answers. I mean, that's, that raises some questions, but that's clearly what he means to say here, right? And is an anathema to the comics, that Steve was talking about earlier, that would come not much later, right? Or that were being produced in this same moment, that embraced the anti-hero, right? So, or at least seemed to embrace the anti-hero. I'm not so sure that Watchmen was a roadmap saying, like, this is what we want, this is what this is supposed to be. But yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's captured right there, and you see these. The other thing that I think helps him with images like this is that there are patterns here which you see throughout his career, and all of his superhero work. These sort of gestures, the staging, the positioning of the character, the layout of the pinup itself. I mean, these are what you see in this image are hallmarks of what defined Ditko's late superhero work.
Mm-hmm. And if I could talk about the late superhero work, my first exposure to Ditko, well, actually the first exposure, and again, this is, man, am I showing my age, was a backup in E-Man of a character called Killjoy,
Mm-hmm.
and it didn't really register. And then there were a couple of reprints in Marvel Treasury Edition, the first Green Goblin appearance, which to my 7-year-old eyes were probably very crude. But very early on in my comic reading experience, there was a reprint in Detective Comics of the first showcase appearance of the Creeper. And for me, though, however brief as it was, for me, that's one pinnacle of Ditko's time, is that first round of work in the late 60s with DC. It just seemed that everything from what the tail end of Marvel, where he was given much more leeway in storytelling, to Charlton, it seemed to all kind of coalesce with that very brief run with DC. And for me, one of the great what ifs is Hawk and Dove. Well, one of the other great what ifs is if Ditko had actually drawn an EC story, given that he was active in '54. God, if he could have just gotten in that last year, given that he was working for their competitors and kind of the same storylines. But for Hawk and Dove, for me, and it's very brief, it's 2 issues and 3 covers, beyond the creations of the characters. But I think that the character designs are impeccable, and basically everything has been a variation of that since that time. The costumes are basically unchanged because they are so potent. The imagery is so potent.
Yeah.
And not that I would elevate it to the level of, or make a statement like without Hawk and Dove you wouldn't get the Adams and O'Neill Green Lantern, Green Arrow, but they certainly are shaking hands. They're certainly cousins in terms of thought. But it just seems to me, with that brief bit that we had, I thought Dove was the closest we came again to him touching Spider-Man. Because of the self-doubt within the character, and there were just some beautiful illustrations, as brief as they were. And the notion of tackling the duality and binary aspect of American politics in what is a very conventional and very commercial form, it just bugs me that we only got those 2 issues. And I was just wondering if you can comment on that, or what your opinion is of that brief run in the late 60s.
I love Hawk and Dove. I think that, and I guess this circles back to Steve's earlier question too. I think that Hawk and Dove was probably had the potential to be the most successful philosophic comic in terms of reaching an audience and getting an audience to understand, right? And as you talk about Dove being sort of very similar to Spider-Man, I couldn't agree more. Like when Dove is dodging and like not really fighting with people, Spider-Man does that all the time. Dove moves a lot like Spider-Man, but Doctor Strange moves that way too. Like when Doctor Strange first goes down, he knows he's physically outmatched, right? And he has those same sort of movements and tactics, right? Those avoidance tactics. And I think that the thing that I love about Hawk and Dove is that you get that character with their dad, Judge Hall, who is very obviously not just the guiding light in the boys' lives, but he's the interlocutor for the reader, right? He's telling the reader, like, this is the lesson of this, right? And the lesson is that neither the hawk nor the dove are the ideal, right? Like he's advocating something different, right? And acknowledging the difference in thought, the difference in ideas, the difference in ways of approaching and imagining the world, right? And very rarely this is one of the things that sticks in that part of the reason that accusing Ditko of like extremist right-wing politics kind of sticks in my craw is it's that like if you read Hawk and Dove, and I know Steve Skeets is involved in these things, and I don't want to dismiss that or subtract him in any way. That would be unfair. But I'm not sure that I read any of the Hawk and Dove stories that Ditko did and got the impression that Hank was right. Right? Like he's not right. He's clearly he's clearly wrong more often than he's not. And that's not to say that Don is always right, but they need each other to balance and understand and sort of be more nuanced and complex in their thinking about the world. And that's how they solve problems, right? That's how they stop crime. That's how they better society, right? By coming together, by rational means. And I write about it in the book, but there's that story in there, that last Ditko story about the escaped convict, right? That Judge Hall, gives some sort of material aid to. I mean, the guy still has to serve his sentence. They don't commute it or anything, but there's a story of redemption in there, right? Like a lot of Ditko's work, there's a story of redemption in those Hawk and Dove comics. That I think people sort of obfuscate or willfully overlook because they've been pre-programmed in certain ways to think about Ditko as that sort of, proto-fascist extremist, thing that I don't think he ever was.
And I'm looking at the clock here, and I have too many questions, but one I definitely wanted to get in. If you look at Ditko's credits after 1998, in terms of mainstream, all you get are 2 inventory stories: one New Gods, one Hulk and Human Torch team up. Again, inventory stories that were not created at the time that they were eventually released. Was there any particular reason that you ever discovered why he abandoned mainstream comics at that time in the late 90s?
Well, I'm not so sure that I think abandoned might be a strong, that to say that he.
Yeah, that might not be the proper parlance. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think he abandoned them. But I think, let's put it to you this way. So like, there are a lot of times when people would write him letters and they would ask him about the past, right? Like, tell me about what you did 55 years ago. He's like, I'm in my 80s. I don't remember. But they would ask him about the past, but like, he had a pat response. He had a canned response that he sent to a lot of people. And it was, I'm a freelance artist. I'm not worried about yesterday. I'm worried about what's next. So I don't know that, given the opportunity, he necessarily would have turned down, more mainstream comics, because he was still drawing, he was still illustrating, and he was still doing mainstream comics. As you say, up through the late 90s. Well, big 2 comics up through the late 90s. So I'm not so sure that it would be fair to say that he abandoned them. But the work just might not have been available. I'm speculating on that, but my intuition tells me that the work just wasn't available, or made available to him. So he's continued to work on other projects. The other thing that I think is worth remembering too is that, and I don't mean to suppose to, or I don't want to be presumptuous and assume that I understand or why he made certain artistic choices for certain projects, or claim that I know why he made certain artistic choices for certain projects. But I think if you look really, even in the 80s and beyond, if you look at the work he was doing at DC and Marvel and compare it to the work he was doing at the exact same time for his own enjoyment, for his own independent work, like if you compare The Mocker to or Static to Rom, or to Chuck Norris and the Karate Commandos, or even Speedball, which I happen to like. If you compare The Mocker and Static to that, boy, like the level of like draftsmanship and like the detail and like the layouts, everything is so much different and so much more invested. It feels more invested than those other mainstream comics that are inked by other people, right? Other people who often say that they felt that they needed to rein him in a little bit. That's not because he couldn't draw.
Yeah.
So my instinct tells me that those were not passion projects for him.
Yeah.
And they were paychecks, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. But I think that's just a labor thing.
Okay. Going on to Steve. Steve, what else do you have for Zack?
Well, I mean, I bogared way too much time earlier, so I'm not going to take too much.
I'm having fun.
But actually, I want to bring up a question that came through, or actually an observation that came through from one of our watchers, listeners, viewers, etc. John Runyon had made mention of Hawk and Dove, and this is interesting because when I was familiar with Hawk and Dove, it was when Dawn Granger had already been brought in. So Dawn had been killed at some point. I can't remember the character in the 80s or so. So long after Ditko had abandoned. Yeah, in Crisis, yeah. Long after Ditko had abandoned or had no longer been part of the character's storyline. But his question here is, he hasn't read any of the Hawk and Dove back issues, so he's only lightly familiar with them. He loves the characters in the Titans TV show on HBO Max, however, and I was curious if the renditions in that show compare nicely to the original issues or not so much. And I would say not so much. At all. But
so Hothead Hank is still there.
Hank's still
Hothead Hank is still there.
Hothead.
Yeah.
But I don't know, Zach. Have you seen the Titans series on DC Universe or now HBO Max?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not familiar with that. But as it relates to adaptations, I do remember liking the Dwayne McDuffie takes on them and for the Justice League cartoons.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah.
I think Dwayne McDuffie tried as hard as anyone to, in writing those Justice League episodes, tried as hard as anyone to capture Ditko in a reasonable way without betraying his own beliefs, while also acknowledging how he interpreted those characters.
Yeah.
So that I think that so if he's looking for like good adaptations, I think the Justice League cartoon versions are good.
And a beautiful meta moment in that you have two actors that are known as brothers, in Fred Savage and Jason Hervey, doing the voices there, and also kind of a flip flop of what you had seen in the Wonder Years. Bryan, do you have anything else you want to add there for Zach? There, any last thing to get in?
No, I mean, this has been so amazing. I am interested in your reading of Rorschach. I don't know if we're going to be able to discuss that or not tonight, but I am a big fan of Tom King's as well. And it is interesting now that I'm learning more about Ditko's real, and in context sort of beliefs compared to like the interpretation lens that we put on him. It is an interesting sort of dialogue among like the Watchmen and Watchmen products like Rorschach and the original Ditko version of The Question and Mr. A. So I think I am ceding my time to the gentleman from New Jersey.
Okay.
Before we go back though, I did want to say, and I agree with Bryan. I think prior to reading your book, I really was placing on Ditko just my own kind of bias based on years of just accumulating sort of hearsay and other people's interpretations. And I really, because when I was starting to read comics, it was late 80s, and that was a very, very different time to come into superhero comics. And interestingly enough, reading through some of these examples, and I like how you said he was kind of before his time. If you took that version of Doctor Strange from the early, Strange Tales, the very early Ditko Doctor Strange, and placed it in the late 80s or early 90s in Vertigo, it would fit. It really would fit.
Eternity is Vertigo as fuck. Yeah.
And I would not, if Karen Berger was like, "Hey, this guy's got something," let's put him out a book. I probably would have picked it up. But unfortunately, Ditko was kind of like, to me, he was just like, "Oh, it's that Spider-Man guy, kind of crazy, whatever, grumpy, antisocial, whatever." But yeah, so thank you for changing my mind on that.
Good. Hey, for what it's worth, I mean, I was that way too, right? Like when I pick on people for those bad readings, I mean, I'm as guilty of that as anybody. right? Because you hear these things. I mean, we all grow up in relatively the same community. We hear the same stories from the same mouthpieces over and over again. What else are we supposed to do, right? There's, it's absolutely understandable how people come to these conclusions. That's just part of it.
Yeah.
All right, well, we're going to move on to some current comic talk, which we might have to expedite a little bit. But on a personal note, Zach, thank you so much for the acknowledgement in the book. To have my name anywhere within something as high quality as this book is and just also for tonight. I mean, this is probably one of the most intellectual evenings we've had in the 9 years that we've done this show. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, it's like, we're not just talking about anytime we have an opportunity to do something other than how hot Hercules is, we'll grab it.
I want to point out, though, if you're interested in the book Mysterious Travelers, there is a link to the UPress for University of Mississippi Press link, and then of course Zach's Tumblr is his primary website for any whatever. I don't even. What do you post on the Tumblr? Do you post your scholarly musings, or is it porn, or is it?
I can't. You'll have to go and find out. I think it's mostly just a feed where the podcast links for my show get sent. That's really all that's there. Mm-hmm. And I have some other links up there, but I also use that to keep. I archive some of the old mystery solves so that I have easy access to those when I go to apply for my pro passes for conventions. So like, if you go to this website, here's this 10-year-old comic. Please to enjoy.
I actually have the hard copy of Mystery Solved.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that was first Comic Geek Speak convention that I went to. That's when you had that. Yeah. And you probably should at least plug your own podcast because it's excellent. Pictures Within Pictures, which you have with comic writer Will Pfeiffer and Ben Teed. Even when I disagree with you guys, it's like you make your points so eloquently that I question myself. And seriously, there are one that comes to mind, Eddingville Club. I don't think I ever would have picked up that book if not for the episode where you profile that. So another excellent podcast. So if you want to plug that, please do, because people should be listening to it.
Yeah, there it is right there. So I hope folks do listen to Pictures Within Pictures. We record really sporadically just as we kind of get time to do it. But we do 2 episodes at a time. So one's a book of the month month. And then another one that's just what you're reading.
Okay. Well, that's a very good segue into what we're reading right now. So I'm going to start with my lucky charm every time. So, Steve, tell us about something you're reading that you're digging.
So real quick, one of the books that I've been reading is Redemption. Redemption #1 just came out. It's published by AWA, which might as well be Artists with Attitudes because they do some pretty good stuff. Krista Faust is with writing duties on here with Mike Deodato Jr. On art. And they actually just worked together on Bad Mother. That 5-part series came out towards the end of last year. That was also really interesting. It was kind of a sort of a modern twist on true crime with a housewife. But this is really interesting. It is a post-apocalyptic Western style, kind of like a Mad Max type era mixed with prospector chic. But it's really fantastic, and I'm not going to give away too much about it. The main character, or one of the main characters of this, is a older queer woman who's also a total badass. It's basically she is sort of a lone gun avenging angel, so to speak, who's more or less retired and tried to put herself out in the middle of the wasteland. And of course, somebody does have to go and find her. to save the day in their town that's being oppressed by the local evil sheriff / preacher. So, totally recommend it if you're into sort of, post-apocalyptic westerns with a queer main character. Redemption #1 just came out. It is another 5-part series by Krista Faust and Mike Deodato Jr.
All right. Let's move over to Zach now. Zach, tell us about something you're reading that you're digging.
One thing that I read recently that I really love is King Cat Comics and Stories number 80 from John Porcellino. Do you guys read King Cat?
No, I can say I don't.
Oh, okay. So for the boys and girls at home, if you love animals, like you have a cat, you have a dog, you love them, do you love them a whole lot? You need to read King Cat 75. It will destroy you. You'll just end. That's it. You'll just end, and then you'll be nothing, because it is the most beautiful and heart-wrenching and just body-destroying comic you'll ever read. It's amazing. So John Porcellino, I think, is actually one of the truly great cartoonists, independent cartoonists right now. And this week, Drawn and Quarterly just released a whole bunch of reissues of collections of King Cat. They're not called King Cat; they're like on Lone Mountain and and things like that. But I think that they're just wonderful, wonderful stories, and they're really sincere. This issue I got because I support John on Patreon, but it's available to anyone that wants to get it. This issue mostly discusses he and his partner getting their new dog that they adopted, and it's just cute stories about getting the dog and sharing a new life with the dog, and the dog getting adjusted, but it also takes breaks in between to just sort of contemplate and think and be it's a comic that I'm glad I read now, even as things are still very much on fire all around us. It was a very calming, Zen-like experience, reading some of these short stories and that sort of thing, because they make an effort to slow down and be at peace and try to remind others of that sort of kindness and peacefulness that is still possible. So it's really touching stuff, and I can't support John's work enough. I think he's one of the great working cartoonists.
All right, thanks so much for that. And let's go over to Bryan. Bryan, what's something you're reading that you're digging?
As I alluded to earlier, I have been reading Rorschach, and issue number 5 came out from Tom King. I don't feel like I want to spoil too much about this because there is some turns, but what I can say, if you've been following our discussions about Rorschach, up until now, it has been very much a look back at the mystery of this new modern Rorschach sort of incarnation or incarnations as of the last issue. And so that has sort of been the scope of the Watchmen element, a little bit also with the sort of psychic squid stuff. But this issue, issue number 5, I believe, has another turn where it actually catches up with the current political events that sort of kicked off the first issue. Is it John Turley, Governor Turley, who is the attempted assassinee of the assassination, is involved and discusses his sort of view of the world. You get a little bit of an insight into that character with the detective that is investigating the assassination attempt, and then the murder, or basically the killing of the Rorschach and the kid in that first issue. So interesting stuff. It kind of touches on some of the Trump QAnon sort of. My takeaway, and I don't know, Zach, if you've read this yet, but my takeaway is sort of the viral nature of ideology and how the character of the comedian in some ways sort of informs some of the Turley character's worldview and sort of the viral ideology that his campaign is using, that is not too dissimilar from a Reagan or a Trump, certainly. So it ends with a very interesting little sort of tease, sort of I don't even know what to make of it, sort of panel where you sort of see where the detective's mind is at. And knowing that the Rorschach character also has a bit of a viral ideology sort of thing built into it, really points an interesting direction for this series to go in. So I don't know, Zach, are you reading this as they come out, or is this something you're catching up on later?
I'm only through the first 3 issues right now, so I can't say anything about what's happening in this one. But the viral ideology stuff, I mean, that's in the air, right? Like that's in the zeitgeist right now. So
yeah, it's very. I love Tom King, as we talked about earlier. I think he's one of the smartest writers in comics, and oh gosh, it's so easy. Again, I think with this Ditko discussion, what's really fascinating to me now is it's easy to put a lens on things that gives you like that ideology perspective you think you have. And I think Tom King is a writer who's very open about his politics and sort of writes with maybe a heavy pen, so to speak. But like, there's some stuff going on here that isn't so cut and dry.
Yeah.
Mainly the flipping of the script of the Redford and how Redford is sort of this kind of like, Truman, not Truman, is it Truman? Eisenhower, like just FDR, sorry, Roosevelt. Too many names. I'll just keep naming presidents and I'll get it right. So the FDR sort of like, when's he not gonna be president anymore, right? It's an interesting difference, sort of in the world of the Watchmen characters. So anyway, I'm interested, Zach, when you get to this, I'd love to hear what you think about what Tom is trying to talk to here in exploring this world of the Watchmen, and specifically through that Rorschach sort of embodiment. So anyway, it's really good stuff.
It's been exciting to read so far. It's been very interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So I guess it's for me. And I also can say, Brian, I did read 4, which covered the strongman who befriended the kid, and went to some places I wasn't expecting it to. So good stuff. I received a whole bunch of comics on Saturday, and my intention was to get through as much of Future State as possible. Let me tell you, I'm all like a very positive Polly. La Bamba. Oh, this is so bad. Just across the board. So I had to have a nice palate cleanser. And after reading Zach's book, my palate cleansers were the 2 volumes of the Action Heroes archives from DC. These are technically out of print, but you can find copies for fairly reasonable prices, at least close to cover. A couple of months ago, these were intended to be reissued effectively as Road to Watchmen, with one covering Captain Atom, which is this one, and the other one with Blue Beetle and Question. And it provides all of the material that Ditko had done at Charlton for the Action Heroes line. The original Captain Atom, that's still steeped in space race paranoia and just wasn't anything I really gravitated towards. But when we get to the Action Hero line, it's vibrant as hell. And especially on the white paper, man, this stuff just pops. So if you want to sample this stuff, you will probably be able to find those archive editions. And this is just something I would like to interject with what John Runyon had asked. If you do have the DC Universe Infinite or on Comixology, you do have the Captain Atom run, the second Captain Atom run, and you do have all of Hawk and Dove available digitally. So you can sample some of the works that we've talked about through that. All right, Zach, thank you so much. Oh, wait a second. We got the Woofs of the Week. Oh man, this is me trying to speed it through, and I'll make a bigger deal because Tom Anderson likes when I do this. So when we wrap up an episode of the Comic Book Bears, we do so with a segment we call the Woofs of the Week segment. In the bear community, if you find a fella attractive, you woof at him, and we do something very similar here. This is where we have an opportunity to showcase something which may not necessarily be a comic book. It might be a film or a TV program or a charitable initiative, anything under the sun that we think you, fair listener, may be interested in sampling. I'll start, as I always do, with Steve. Steve, what is your Woof of the Week?
There was one I was going to talk about, but I think I'll save that for next time, or you might actually be talking about it. So I'll talk about this book that I got with my delivery over the weekend. OK Universe which is put out by Drawn and Quarterly. It's a very, very loosely, I'd say, a hidden autobiography of Valerie Plante, who is the mayor of Montreal. When she got into politics, she kind of covered, she basically went from just being a community activist, to city council to being the mayor. And so this book is essentially about her, even though she cleverly changes her name in it. And it's drawn by Delphine Cote-Lacroix. It's excellent. It made me get all warm and fuzzy and nostalgic for Montreal. And the book itself is just very beautifully done. Really, great, sort of almost like a paper cut kind of style to it. But great story, really, really wonderful, and great to see sort of a very grassroots political campaign, very different from anything that we've seen here in the U.S. So I recommend picking it up. OK Universe by Drawn and Quarterly.
Okay, cool. I'll stick with the order we had in the books there. So Zach, if you would like to join us in the Wolf of the Week, please do so.
Oh, I'd love to, because I just happen to have one. So today I finished this book, Ben Lerner's The Topeka School novel. I don't know if y'all are familiar with this, but we're all of basically the same age. This is a really wonderful archaeology of masculinity and men and teen life for Gen Xers and Zennials, and addressing how our experiences growing up really help us better understand the horrors that we all are experiencing now. It is a delightful and heartbreaking book that's about memory and language and trauma and masculinity, and how all of those things were just decimated by our practices and behaviors throughout the 70s and 80s and in the 90s, and trying to reconstitute them into something more positive, and the shortcomings and the limitations of that reconstitution. It is an incredible work, and I plowed right through it, and it takes place, it's called the Topeka School. It takes place in the Midwest. As a Midwest kid, I felt this book in my bones. Like I knew these people. If I wasn't these people at some point, I knew these people personally. It's a very powerful, fascinating book. I cannot recommend it highly enough.
Sounds really cool. All right, let's move over to Bryan. Bryan, what is your Wolf of the Week?
I have a very quick wolf. It's because Northwest Press sent me this, and I had not got this yet. And we mentioned it earlier when we talked about Dash, but I wanted to give Vinny Rico and Dave Abersole and Delia Gable a shout out for this lovely reminder that Dash does not like fascism. And if you have not read Dash, Northwest Press still has copies available for you to go out and get your copy of the complete, up until now at least, Dash comic 1 through 6, I believe. And it's a very exciting time because obviously we know from a few interviews that we've done with Dave and the gang that there's more Dash coming. So please go check out Dash on the Northwest Press website. And they may even have these awesome little prints available. Vinny did a killer job, and especially in light of Christopher Plummer's passing, which I think this is not quite, but sort of a reference-ish to. I think it's, we should all support this ideology of rejection of a certain ideology. So yeah, go check out Dash at northwestpress.com.
Yeah. Zach, if you're unfamiliar with Dash, it was an ongoing series from Northwest Press, which was, I guess, the quickest cut you could give was a post-World War II supernatural noir.
Oh.
Yeah, some really interesting stuff, and the writer Dave Ebersole has become a good friend of the show and a good friend of ours, so it's something worth checking out. My Wolf of the Week is a film. This is a movie that is streaming right now on Amazon, on Shout Factory's own website, on Tubi, on Pluto, so all of those freebie sites. And the documentary I'm talking about is Jay Sebring, Cutting to the Truth. It's directed by Anthony DeMara, who actually is Jay Sebring's nephew. And if you're unfamiliar with the name Jay Sebring, you might be more familiar with the name Sharon Tate. And he was one of the individuals killed during the first night of the Manson family murders. And he was effectively a star in his own right as well. He was a pioneer in men's hairstyling. Steve McQueen considered him his best friend. He was basically responsible for Bruce Lee's introduction into Hollywood. If you ever wanted to have a main like Jim Morrison on the early Doors albums, you can thank Sebring for his stylization there. And it was a really effective and powerful profile of somebody who shouldn't be forgotten. Again, there's so much sensationalism about the Manson family murders, and certainly the film goes into the commercialization of Manson post killings, and also dispelled some things that were incorrect that people have since 1969 have assumed took place on the night of the murder. So it was probably like just under 2 hours. And again, it's available on various platforms. Again, that film name is Jay Sebring, Cutting to the Truth. I almost got that wrong the second time. So that's my Wolf of the Week. All right. Again, Zach, thank you so much for joining us. This has been, like I said, erudite doesn't begin to say how this episode has transpired. It's really been a wonderful, wonderful discussion. And again, we have the graphic up for your book there, Mysterious Travelers, Steve Ditko and the Search for a New Liberal Identity.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for having me. This has been a genuine joy. Like, I really appreciate this.
Oh, our pleasure, our pleasure. And, anytime you want to come back, whether it's to promote another book, which we hope this is the first of a couple, please do. So we're going to wrap this one up. Again, we are the Comic Book Bears podcast. You can find us on the Twitter and the Tumblr and the Instagram as Comic Book Bears. You can find us on the Facebook as Comic Book Bears podcast. If you want to listen to us, please download us through iTunes, listen to us through Stitcher Radio, and you can catch us on various other podcasting platforms. If you want to write to us, please do so by sending an email to comicbookbears@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Bill Zanowitz.
I'm Brian Pittard.
I'm Steve Morey.
And we'll be back next week. Take care, everyone.